Okay, everybody. Today I want to talk to you about a couple, well, really one basic shape when it comes to drawing. So that would be the cylinder. Cylinders, cubes, and spheres really make up the components of everything that we draw. So they're super important. And this is a painting that I made recently. I enjoy painting things like this, just simple studies of objects. Tin cans in particular, just because I think they're kind of decorative. I really enjoy it. It's kind of fun. They're about life size. And so I wanted to show you that the anatomy or the knowledge of how a cylinder works can really come into play when you're doing things like still lives, but eventually into figure drawing and just kind of making things up out of your head as well. So for illustrators and animators, it's super important. So today we'll talk about basic views, like a tabletop view like this, but we'll also talk about what happens when a cylinder flips on its side from all different angles. So let's get right into it. So first of all, we all know that a cylinder, say a tin can, is a true circle from the top view. And what gets difficult is as we start to turn and twist it in space, that circle becomes distorted and it becomes more of an oval shape, or in art we call that an ellipse. So go ahead and make sure you write that down. Cylinder and ellipses are two words that are always going to be going together and we'll be talking about a lot. So achieving that ellipse shape is quite difficult in the beginning, and I'll show you some tips and tricks for making that happen. So let's get right into it. When I draw today, just so you know, I'm going to be using a Palomino Blackwing pencil. Really like those. They get a nice rich dark tone, and they come with an eraser on them, which is kind of nice. Notice that the pencil is super sharp right now. Keep those pencils sharp as you guys work. Extremely important. So let's start with a cylinder kind of from a tabletop view, the way we might see it sitting on your kitchen table or something. So I'm going to start with that elliptical shape. Now I'm just freehanding right now, but I'll show you how to check yourself on this. So long, skinny ellipse. All right, now I'm going to make it kind of a tin can shape, so a little taller than it is wide. And then at the bottom of our cylinder, there's always going to be a little bit of an elliptical shape as well. Because on a tin can, you have a circle at the top and at the bottom. Nothing's ever truly flat. All right, now some ways to check ourselves. So the very first thing is, if we have a cylinder sitting on a tabletop, these edge lines are always going to be truly vertical. So we have to check ourselves and make sure those are straight up and down lines. Looks pretty good to me right now. Now what I'll always do when breaking that cylinder down is run a midline right through the middle too. And that's just a vertical, very light. It's going to help me in just a second. And I'm just eyeballing middle, but there are ways you can check that. So for example, by using my pencil and just a finger, I'm going to line up my eraser to the midline. I'm going to lock my finger on this right edge. And now I can see how close is my right side to the left side. I'm close, but my right side's a little bit wider, which means that if I want to get a true center line, I should probably scoot it over just a little bit. So now let's double check that again. Pretty darn close. So that's a nice midline right there down the center of this cylinder. So the reason why I find that center line is that that's going to be the high point and the low point of my ellipse down the road. So the next thing I do is on the left and right side of my ellipse, the widest points, I need a nice flat horizontal line between those two. Now theoretically, if I'm eyeballing this right, and we're just freehanding this, but this should be true horizontal, true vertical, they're perpendicular to each other. So we just made a crosshair through that elliptical shape. So now I have a left point, a right point to my ellipse. I also have a high point and a low point, which is extremely important. So now that I've started to line those 4 points up, or find those 4 points in space, I'm going to kind of connect the dots. Now there's one last thing I need to figure out. So one, I want to make sure that my right point to the middle and my left point to the middle, okay, they're pretty close. That's good. Now the next thing is, I can already see this is a little off. My low point, my ellipse comes down kind of a little further from the middle here than it does from the top. That's not a good sign. It means that's not totally symmetrical. So what I'm going to do is raise this point up a smidge until I know for sure, okay, those are exactly the same right now from point A to B and from B to C. All right, so now's the part where I can start to tidy up this elliptical shape here. So notice I'm still being a little bit loose with my ellipse, which is fine. That's where we want to be right now. We can really tidy it up later on. Now there's kind of an art to getting these curves smooth. You will find that your hand will become more and more used to making this shape, and you get a little bit of muscle memory for it as you go in drawing. Early on, it's going to feel a little bit awkward probably, but that's not a bad example of an ellipse in about this perspective, right? Nice. Okay, so that's my ellipse number one. From there, obviously we could tighten up these lines, clean them up a bit until we get down to the bottom of our cylinder. And at the baseline, it's the same sort of thing. I need to make sure that this is a flat line where it sits on the table. That's always going to be horizontal unless your table was crooked, which shouldn't be the case. And then at the bottom of this ellipse, I want that distance between my halfway point and the bottom to be at least as long as it was up top. All right, so I'm going to find that subtle curve at the bottom of this ellipse. Now, if I wanted to continue and make it look like this thing was a glass jar and I could see through it, we're looking at that sort of shape through there. Okay, so that is the anatomy of the cylinder, and I double check myself all the time because it's really hard to get those right without having those construction lines visible. So a couple things. That's getting close to our eye level when we're looking at a can like this. Now at a certain point, that cylinder would disappear and it would look flat. And there's only one perspective right at your eye level where you would see that. Now as we start to look downhill more and more, if we stand up higher and higher looking at this tin can, we see more and more of that ellipse. So practice for yourself. Let's try a couple of these where we start to see a bit more and more of the ellipse. So this would be looking slightly more downhill. So I'm going to make a slightly wider elliptical form. And then this would be looking way more downhill. Starting to get more like a true circle. Still obviously wider than it is tall, but getting closer and closer to that true circle form. So I'm going to build a second cylinder right here. And for these, you can make them as tall or as short as you want them to be. We're just making these up here right now. All right, so let's go ahead, and the one thing I want to double check is, obviously, this is wider than this, good. This one wider than this, good. So each one I'm looking a little bit more downhill on my cylinder. So I'm going to double check myself one more time. I'm going to find a midline. Find my horizontal axis. You'll get better and better at eyeballing these axis lines as you go. So for example, let's double check. Hopefully I'm in the ballpark of halfway. 1, 2, good. 1, 2, pretty good. If you're checking yourself and you're way off, that's pretty normal early on. You get better and better at that eyeballing as you go. So again, finding my extreme points, high, low, left and right. And then finding that nice arc around them. Now, I should note this. I meant to mention this on my first one, but I'll talk about it now. There's going to be 2 pitfalls you might fall into on ellipses. I talk to my students all the time about this. You could either make a hot dog ellipse, which looks something like this. That's not an ellipse, that's a hot dog. It's kind of flat here and then it rounds out on the edges. The other thing that you could fall into, and we don't want that. The other thing we could fall into is a kind of squished football shape or like a Hey Arnold head, something like that. So we don't want any hard corners and we don't want a circular edge. We want something right in between, a nice quick curve, and that's that mark that your wrist and your hand is going to get better and better at making that curved shape at the edge of our ellipses. All right, so again, cleaning up those lines just a little bit. It's a really good way to practice our straight vertical lines as well. Okay, and then the bottom line, again, just as curved, maybe a bit more curved than that top edge. Beautiful. All right, last one. Little bit higher of an eye level here. Okay, let's make sure I'm left and right, top and bottom. Notice that my edge becomes a bit more circular here than it would there. And that makes sense because we're seeing more and more of that circle shape now. Right? This is great practice to keep working on those curves and arc forms. Once again, as curved at the bottom as it would be at the top. You don't want to make a beautiful ellipse on the top of your can, and I'll show you this in just a second. I've seen a lot of ellipses that look pretty nice on the top of a can. Okay, it feels rounded, and then you get to the bottom and it kind of flattens out a little too much. That's going to destroy your sense of space in the drawing. Okay, so one last note. When we're looking at a can like this, or maybe even this perspective, which is close to our drawing here, our edges should appear very vertical. Now, notice as I start to go extremely angled, this would be if you're standing up, hovering over a table and looking down. Check out what just happened to the vertical line. Right here, you can kind of compare it to my edge of my tin can. Okay, feels pretty vertical, pretty vertical. As we twist this, check this out. That vertical line, super angled downhill. So what's happening is a distorted kind of bird's eye view. It's like if you're up in the Empire State Building looking down at the lower buildings below. Those angles appear, or I'm sorry, those edges of the buildings, or in this case a can, appear to vanish away at an angle, an extreme angle. So that is getting into some perspective, which we're going to talk about soon. But what's happening is those edges start to distort in our line of vision. So I'm going to go ahead and show you one of those, an angle like that. So I'm going to, let's jump over here. What happens is, this is only when our cylinders or ellipses start to get closer and closer to a circle. So we're looking much more extremely downhill on our canister. Now, the height still should be a little shorter than the width. Beautiful, because it's not a true circle yet. Then we wouldn't be able to see the edge. Now what happens is, it looks really weird if you put totally flat or vertical lines there. So what I'm going to start to do is, it's not super exaggerated, but I'm angling my vertical edges in a little bit. And the more and more of that top plane that you see, the less of this edge you're going to see, and a more sharp angle you're going to see as well. So that's where we're starting to get that kind of a little bit of a V shape in here as it zooms away from us. All right, so same sort of thing though. This should be a nice horizontal line from our left and right edges. We should be at a nice horizontal plane. That's good. Okay, fairly parallel. Midline-ish should be vertical. Let's double check middle. Right to mid, left to mid, good. That all looks pretty good. Let's check our distance here. Close enough, all right. So you'll notice, just like in our earlier projects, starting out very gestural and loose, but at a certain point, and that point is right now for me, we have to find actual points, hard points in our drawings to connect to and to clean up our lines. Otherwise, it's hard to pinpoint where we are in the drawing anymore. So that first pass is very loose. Second pass, I start to clean up a little bit. Okay, beautiful. Now, the only thing I need to check on is to be careful. When I started this drawing, I did not scoop this bottom ellipse nearly enough. So to really show the exaggeration of our view, we need to make this much more circular down here, because again, we want the same sort of bow in the bottom image as we do, or the bottom side of this can as we would the top. All right. Beautiful. So that's going to help us with that sense of perspective, that sense of three-dimensional volume wrapping around the cylinder. All right, so keep practicing those in the sketchbook. What I would like for you all to do is to have a page of cylinders as if they're sitting on a tabletop, just like this, looking across the cylinder or down on the cylinder, at least 8 different cylinders on your sketchbook page, that smaller 11 by 14 sketchbook, in various views. Again, kind of standing vertically like this. So you've got 4 here that you drew with me. Practice 4 more on that sketchbook page. Bear with me while I'm sharpening my pencil here. Okay, so the next thing I want to start to talk about is, and this gets tricky, when a cylinder is laying down on a table. And so that could look like this, could start to change and look like this. Where it gets pretty difficult is where you're kind of looking down the barrel of a cylinder, something like this. So we'll talk about all of those a little bit. Let's talk about a slightly easier one. Let's think about a cylinder laying on a table, and we're looking at more of a side view of it. So maybe there's a little bit of a slope to it. Something like this. That's what I'm going to be looking at. So a bit of a downward angle. I'm going down to the left. Now, this is really important. What I like to do first is I'm just going to block off a little bit of a rectangle shape for the boundaries of my cylinder, kind of like this rectangular box right here. Now, what's important is I want this line to be perpendicular to this line. So check this out. This line is angled downhill. It's not totally flat, right? So the way I can check perpendicular, now I don't require that you guys have something like this all the time in your drawings, but a little bit of a corner, a right angle corner like this can be handy because, hey, that's a good way to check myself. And that's a 90-degree angle. Those are perpendicular. That's good. And these are pretty perpendicular right here. Good sign. Just like we could double check our verticals and horizontals in our other cylinders. So that's extremely important, because what you see a lot of is you'll see somebody start to guesstimate this angle just perfectly, but their cylinders, they make straight up and down, and then you get this very weird distortion that happens. So always those are going to be perpendicular no matter what these angles are. All right, so let's make the opening the top of our cylinder over here. So again, this is kind of a skinny view. All right, just guesstimating for right now. Again, the perspective we're thinking about is maybe somewhere in this kind of a zone. All right, the back side. Now, an important check that I don't want to forget about is a parallel line roughly to these two edges, all in parallel unison with each other. That's our midline. We can double check ourselves. Beautiful. So that means that if this is our midline here, those are going to be our widest bows to the ellipses, or the widest curve point, right along this edge. Okay, now I have my 4 points to connect to. And again, that early structure helps me to make a cylinder on its side so much better than I could have done if I was just, you know, freehanding it, just totally going off of my own best guesstimate. So let's use that same idea, but even try something a little bit trickier. So let's take a look at looking down the barrel of a cylinder a little bit more. And you'll see this sometimes in still lives where you have a pipe, you have a canister, and it's laying sideways, and you're kind of looking at it a bit more like this. So you're not square on, that would just look like a circle, but you're looking a little downhill on it, and that the edges of the cylinder are zooming back in space. So let's try to imagine what that might look like here. So again, you're on a tabletop. We're kind of looking straight down the barrel of the top of this canister. Now, I still want to make sure it's a little taller than it is wide, so let's double check this. A little taller than it is wide, that's a good sign, because it's still in perspective and distorted a bit. Now, what's going to happen is, let's just double check as a reference. All right, these lines start to appear just like when we were looking directly downhill on our canister in the past. They start to appear to converge to a point. So what I mean by that is they aren't going to be totally parallel to each other anymore. They're going to zoom back and almost appear as if eventually those two lines are going to meet in a point in the distance. So that's step number one. All right, now the slightly tricky part, and we could end this anywhere. It's a little bit arbitrary right now, the decision we're making. But let's say if it's a true, like a beer can, something like this, a soda can, this would be too short, I think. This would be way too long. So I'm gonna say somewhere around here might be how it would appear to distort in space. All right, now this line's gonna be a little more curved than I'm used to, because again, we're looking at a more extreme view. Now here's a slightly tricky part to this view right here. I need to guesstimate what a perpendicular line is here to these lines. Now what's tricky is these lines aren't parallel anymore. So the first thing I'm gonna do is guesstimate my middle line. Now what I have to do here is imagine I'm the hand of a clock and I'm pivoting a bit. So between this extreme angle and this one, well, it's about the average or the mean. Right around there feels pretty good. So that's going to be my middle axis line, the direction that this can is spiraling or laying on in space. Now, if you notice, that's a good sign. The bow of or arc of this curve and the arc of this curve, that's going to be a wide point. It's also going to be a wide point over here. So all good signs that those are kind of already lining up. Now, the extreme edges here, I now need to find a perpendicular line to this. So it's not vertical anymore because this axis line is no longer vertical. So if we were looking at this, we're going and spinning it. So we're looking at more of a line like this. These get very tricky. So if you're making these in your sketchbook and you have any kind of a right angle tool, check that out. That's a pretty good way to check yourself. All right, so we now have a horizontal and vertical axis. I need to get my vertical axis here. Okay, beautiful. So that's going to be where my curve starts on this side. Now I can find my high point, my low point, and my extreme left and right points. Start to really clean up, tidy up my curves. Now these, I think these wider ellipses are actually harder for me because I draw them less often. So you can actually see me, this is good, you can see me kind of struggling to find this proportion. I went a little dark, a little bit fast, so all I'm doing is taking a small kneaded eraser and I'm washing over this image a little bit. You can kind of see how funky this looks. Almost bows out a little too much right here. So I'm just gonna come back and slowly try to reshape that curve in a way that feels just a little bit more fluid, a more believable arc. So don't hold back being a little critical of your own drawings. Step back and look at them and ask yourself, does that appear to be a circle in space, distorted in space, or does it seem a little bit wonky? Are there spots that kind of bow out a little too much? When you step back and kind of look from a distance, you'll start to see where it feels a little off. All right, that's starting to get there, I think. So now I can take this, clean up my lines a little bit. All right. Beautiful. So that's a slightly more distorted view of a cylinder right there. All right. So in the same way that we did about 8 of these on a sketchbook page, take a second sketchbook page for yourself and try to do maybe about 8 cylinders floating in space all along that page. So you could do things like this. Notice both of mine are turned in the same way. So you could try to change your axis points and have a few kind of floating in space in all different directions, right? Now these can be a little loose and sketchy, the way that I'm doing right here, but I would ask that you try to clean them up a little bit and get a more contour style line on top of that loose gestural base. So again, 8 versions of your canisters sitting vertically as if they were on a tabletop in multiple different styles of view, different points of view, and about 8 of these floating in space on a separate page, all turned sideways in different directions. If it helps you, take some sort of a canister, whatever it is. This is a cap to, I don't know, a spray can, and play with different angles on your desk, letting it sit so that you have a little something to check out. You don't have to just make these up from your head, for sure. And then just one last thought on why it's important to think about cylinders or to really spend a little bit of time on these basic shapes, because you might think, oh my goodness, I can't draw another cylinder. But just remember that when we get into cylinders, cubes, spheres, cones, those types of basic shapes make up all the more complicated shapes that we see. So I know it's pretty obvious that the cylinder is the base form for a bottle like this. But if you know in your head how to create a good cylinder in space, so I'm just going to carve out a real quick cylinder here. And somebody told me to draw a water bottle or a wine bottle or anything like that. Say I'm doing it for a storyboard, for an animation, or for some sort of video I'm about to make. All right, well, if I needed to make a more complicated bottle, something like this, I could say, okay, well, I know how to make a simple cylinder. Now, in order to carve into that same shape, something a little more complicated, well, I need my midlines. All right, let's say this juice bottle right here. Okay, I know that this is the widest point. Angles in, there's a smaller cylinder right here, and there's that cap cylinder on top. So, a thinner cylinder, that's just gonna be a vertical line. I'm using my midpoint to make sure that I'm equidistant from either side. I've got my kind of shoulders, the humps on that bottle. I'm going to use a couple axis lines to make sure that I'm level. If I don't do that, I get all lopsided from one side to the other. Now I know that this shouldn't be flat. That's really a cylinder, so I'm going to curve that line. That's my low point right along the middle. I'm going to curve this line. Again, low point right along the middle. And check that out. All of a sudden, very dimensionally, I can start to bring out a much better version of that water bottle than I would have thought I could have ever done, just because I really know how to make a cylinder. And if you can make a simple cylinder, you can make a really complex cylinder too. It's just a matter of using that same kind of method to build more and more detail. So I'm not doing anything here that we didn't talk about earlier. Well, I can do it a little faster than you all probably can, but see if you can't follow my logic here. and try something out a little more complicated for yourself. So now we have the cap, a little bit of a neck sitting underneath it, the bow of the shoulders, and you could use this formula to make any kind of complicated shapes, bottles, piping systems. It could be, drawing a complex image of an engine, right? You'd have all kinds of cylindrical types of forms and caps. Maybe you just want to do some still life, some serious still life. So definitely knowledge of cylinders helped me a lot in something like this. And cylindrical forms are going to help you when you get into drawing from the models, figure drawing and anything like that. So there is a reason why we spend so much time on these basic forms. All right, guys, so practice away. Go ahead and do those 8 and 8 in your sketchbook. And if you get the chance, try to find some sort of a water bottle that you have at your house, anything that's kind of sitting at your desk on your table, and practice on like one more complex form as well.